The young man stepped into the grand lobby of the hotel, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and the chandelier above sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars. He adjusted the strap of his leather bag, glancing around with a quiet confidence. He had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a chance to unwind after months of hard work. The city was new to him, but he felt ready to explore it. He approached the front desk, where a man in a crisp suit stood, his name tag reading manager. The young man smiled politely and handed over his reservation details. The manager glanced at the paper, then back at him, his expression shifting subtly. His eyes narrowed, and his lips tightened into a thin line. "Is there a problem?" the young man asked, his tone calm but curious. The manager didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked the young man up and down, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Finally, he spoke, his voice cold and clipped. "I'm afraid we don't have any rooms available." The young man frowned, confused. "But I have a confirmed reservation. I booked it weeks ago." The manager's jaw tightened. "Mistakes happen. We're fully booked. You'll have to find somewhere else." The young man felt a flicker of frustration but kept his composure. "Could you double-check, please? I have the confirmation email right here." He pulled out his phone, ready to show proof. The manager didn't even glance at the phone. "I don't need to see that. I'm telling you, we're full. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other guests to attend to." The dismissive tone stung, but the young man wasn't one to back down easily. "This doesn't make sense. I paid for this reservation. At least let me speak to someone else who can help." The manager's face flushed red, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Listen here," he said, his voice rising slightly. "I don't know what you're trying to pull, but we don't tolerate this kind of behavior. You need to leave. Now." By now, a few guests nearby had stopped to watch the exchange. The young man felt their eyes on him, and his cheeks burned with a mix of anger and embarrassment. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I'm not trying to pull anything. I just want the room I paid for. That's all." The manager stepped out from behind the desk, his posture rigid and intimidating. "I won't ask you again. Leave, or I'll have security escort you out." The young man's heart pounded in his chest. He had never been treated like this before, like he didn't belong, like he was somehow less than. He wanted to argue, to demand justice, but the manager's cold stare and the growing crowd made him feel small and exposed. Reluctantly, he turned and walked toward the exit, his head held high despite the humiliation burning inside him. As he stepped out into the cool evening air, he pulled out his phone, his hands trembling slightly. He dialed a number and waited, his voice steady but laced with emotion when the call connected. "Mom," he said quietly, "I need your help." The young man stood outside the hotel, the city lights flickering around him like distant stars. The cool evening breeze did little to soothe the heat of humiliation still burning in his chest. He paced back and forth, his mind racing. He had always been taught to stand up for himself, to face challenges head-on, but this was different. This wasn't just about a room or a reservation. This was about something deeper, something uglier, and it left him feeling powerless in a way he hadn't before. When his mother answered the phone, her voice was calm but sharp, like the edge of a well-honed blade. She listened without interrupting as he recounted what had happened, her silence speaking volumes. When he finished, there was a brief pause before she spoke. "Stay right there," she said, her tone firm but reassuring. "I'm on my way." Less than an hour later, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and out stepped a woman who commanded attention without saying a word. She was tall and elegant, her tailored coat sweeping just above her ankles. Her hair was styled perfectly, and her eyes, though warm, carried a steely determination. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking against the pavement like a metronome keeping time. The young man felt a surge of relief as she approached. "Mom," he said, his voice tinged with both gratitude and lingering frustration. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "Let's handle this," she said simply, her gaze already fixed on the hotel entrance. Together, they walked back into the lobby. The manager was still at the front desk, now speaking with another guest. His demeanor was polite, almost obsequious, a stark contrast to the way he had treated the young man earlier. When he noticed the woman approaching, his expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly composed himself. "Good evening," he said, his tone professional but wary. "How may I assist you?" The woman didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to make the manager shift uncomfortably. "I'd like to speak with you about an incident that occurred here earlier," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. The manager's eyes flicked to the young man standing beside her, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He straightened his tie, trying to regain his composure. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, ma'am. If there's been some misunderstanding?" "There's no misunderstanding," she interrupted, her tone cutting through his excuses like a knife. "My son had a confirmed reservation at this hotel, and he was denied his room without explanation. I'd like to know why." The manager's face flushed, and he glanced around nervously. A few guests nearby had stopped to listen, their curiosity piqued by the tension in the air. "As I explained to your son," he said, his voice tight, "we were fully booked. It was an unfortunate oversight, but these things happen." The woman's eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer, her presence towering even though she wasn't physically taller. "An oversight," she repeated slowly, as if tasting the word and finding it bitter. "Tell me, do these oversights happen often? Or only to certain guests?" The manager's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on thin ice, and it was beginning to crack beneath him. The woman didn't wait for an answer. She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the counter with deliberate precision. The manager picked it up, his hands trembling slightly as he read the name and title printed on it. His face went pale, and for a moment, it seemed like he might collapse under the weight of his own realization. "I suggest you call your supervisor," the woman said, her voice low but carrying the authority of someone who was used to being heard. "And while you're at it, you might want to start drafting an apology. Because this isn't just about my son. This is about every person who has ever walked through these doors and been made to feel like they don't belong." The manager stared at her, his earlier arrogance replaced by a look of sheer panic. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The woman didn't wait for a response. She turned to her son, her expression softening just enough to let him know she was proud of him for standing his ground. "Let's go," she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll find somewhere else to stay tonight. But this isn't over." As they walked out of the lobby, the young man felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, relief, and a quiet sense of pride. He glanced at his mother, her calm strength a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. Behind them, the manager stood frozen, the business card still clutched in his hand, his world unraveling with every passing second. The night air outside the hotel was crisp, carrying the faint hum of the city's never-ending rhythm. The young man walked beside his mother, his steps slower now, the adrenaline of the confrontation beginning to fade. He glanced at her, her face illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights. She was calm, almost serene, but he could sense the storm brewing beneath the surface. She had always been like this, steady, unshakable, a force of nature wrapped in elegance. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. She turned to him, her expression softening. "Now," she said, "we make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Back at the hotel, the manager was still standing behind the front desk, the business card clutched tightly in his hand. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. He had dealt with difficult guests before, but this was different. This wasn't just a guest, this was someone who could ruin him with a single phone call. He looked down at the card again, the name and title glaring back at him like an accusation. She wasn't just anyone. She was a high-ranking official, a woman known for her work in social justice and equality. Her name carried weight, and her influence stretched far beyond the city limits. The manager's hands trembled as he reached for the phone. He dialed the number for his supervisor, his heart pounding in his chest. When the call connected, he struggled to find the words. "Sir," he began, his voice shaky, "we have a situation." He explained what had happened, leaving out the details of his own behavior but emphasizing the woman's identity. The supervisor's response was immediate and sharp. "Do you have any idea who she is? Do you understand the kind of damage this could do to us?" The manager swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I didn't know, sir. I had no idea." "That's no excuse," the supervisor snapped. "I'm on my way. Don't say another word to anyone until I get there." The call ended, leaving the manager in silence. He felt like the walls were closing in around him, the weight of his actions pressing down on his chest. He had always prided himself on running a tight ship, on maintaining order and control. But now, that control was slipping through his fingers, and he had no one to blame but himself. Meanwhile, the young man and his mother had found a smaller, more welcoming hotel a few blocks away. The staff greeted them warmly, and the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the cold hostility they had just left behind. As they settled into their room, the young man finally allowed himself to relax, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Thank you," he said, looking at his mother. "For standing up for me." She smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "You shouldn't have needed me to," she said. "What happened back there, it's not right. It's not fair. And it's not something you should ever have to face alone." He nodded, her words resonating deeply. He had always known the world could be unfair, but experiencing it firsthand was different. It was raw, personal, and it left a mark. The next morning, the news of the incident began to spread. The young man's mother had made a few calls, and by midday, the story was already gaining traction on social media. People were outraged, and the hotel's reputation was taking a hit. The manager, now a pariah, found himself at the center of a storm he couldn't control. Reporters began calling, asking for statements. The hotel's corporate office issued a vague apology, but it wasn't enough. The public wanted answers, and they wanted accountability. By the afternoon, the young man and his mother were sitting in a small conference room at the hotel, facing the manager and his supervisor. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken words. The supervisor cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "First of all, let me apologize for what happened. This is not the standard we hold ourselves to, and we deeply regret any inconvenience or distress caused." The young man's mother leaned forward, her gaze steady. "This isn't about inconvenience," she said. "This is about discrimination. This is about my son being treated like he didn't belong here simply because of the color of his skin. And this is about making sure it doesn't happen again." The manager flinched, her words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the truth was undeniable. He had acted out of prejudice, and now he was facing the consequences. The supervisor nodded, his expression grim. "You're right," he said. "And we're committed to making changes. Starting with immediate sensitivity training for all staff and a full review of our policies." The young man's mother studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That's a start," she said. "But it's not enough. Real change requires more than just policies. It requires accountability." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The manager looked down at his hands, his earlier arrogance replaced by a deep, uncomfortable shame. He had always thought of himself as a good person, but now he was forced to confront the ugly truth about his own biases. As the meeting drew to a close, the young man felt a sense of closure, but also a renewed determination. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel less than, everyone who had ever been denied their dignity. And as he walked out of the hotel with his mother by his side, he knew that this was just the beginning. The story of the young man and the hotel manager spread like wildfire. By the next morning, it was trending on social media, with hashtags like #justice for the young man and #end discrimination flooding timelines. News outlets picked up the story, and it became the topic of heated discussions on talk shows and radio programs. The public's outrage was palpable, and the hotel found itself at the center of a storm it had never anticipated. The hotel's corporate office scrambled to contain the damage. They issued a formal public apology, emphasizing their commitment to diversity and inclusion. They announced that the manager had been suspended pending a full investigation and promised to implement sweeping changes to prevent such incidents in the future. But for many, the apology felt hollow, a desperate attempt to save face rather than a genuine effort to address the underlying issues. Meanwhile, the young man and his mother were inundated with messages of support. Strangers from all walks of life reached out to share their own stories of discrimination and to thank them for standing up against injustice. The young man was overwhelmed by the outpouring of solidarity, but it also gave him a sense of purpose. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it was a collective one. His mother, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity to turn the incident into a catalyst for change. She reached out to local advocacy groups and arranged a press conference to address the issue publicly. The young man was hesitant at first, he had never been one to seek the spotlight, but his mother's unwavering belief in him gave him the courage to step forward. The day of the press conference arrived, and the venue was packed with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. The young man stood at the podium, his heart pounding as he looked out at the sea of faces. His mother stood beside him, a steadying presence. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "What happened to me at that hotel wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a much larger problem, one that affects countless people every day. I was lucky. I had someone in my corner who could fight for me. But not everyone has that. And that's why we're here today, to demand accountability, not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong." The room erupted in applause, and the young man felt a surge of emotion. He continued, sharing his experience in detail and calling for systemic change in the hospitality industry and beyond. His words were powerful, heartfelt, and deeply personal, resonating with everyone in the room. When his mother stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. She spoke with the authority of someone who had spent years fighting for justice, her words carrying the weight of experience and conviction. "This isn't just about one hotel or one manager," she said. "This is about a culture that allows discrimination to thrive. It's about the biases we carry, often without even realizing it. And it's about the work we all need to do to create a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." Her speech was met with a standing ovation, and the press conference ended on a note of hope and determination. The young man felt a sense of closure, but he also knew that the real work was just beginning. Back at the hotel, the manager was grappling with the fallout of his actions. He had been suspended indefinitely, and his reputation was in tatters. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves, and he found himself isolated and alone. For the first time in his life, he was forced to confront the consequences of his behavior, not just for himself, but for the people he had hurt. One evening, as he sat in his empty apartment, he received a message from an old friend. It was a link to an article about the press conference, along with a simple question: "Is this true?" The manager hesitated before clicking the link. As he read the article, he felt a wave of shame and regret. He had always thought of himself as a fair and just person, but the reality was far more complicated. He had acted out of prejudice, and now he was paying the price. But amidst the guilt, there was also a glimmer of something else, a desire to change. He didn't know how to begin, but he knew he had to try. He reached out to a local organization that offered anti-bias training and signed up for their next workshop. It was a small step, but it was a start. The young man, meanwhile, was adjusting to his new role as an advocate. He received invitations to speak at schools, community centers, and even corporate events. Each time he shared his story, he felt a little stronger, a little more hopeful. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew he wasn't alone. As the weeks passed, the hotel began to implement the changes it had promised. Staff underwent mandatory sensitivity training, and new policies were put in place to ensure that no one would ever be turned away because of their race or background. The young man and his mother were invited to consult on these changes, and they accepted, determined to hold the hotel accountable. The story of the young man and the hotel manager became a symbol of the fight against discrimination, a reminder that change is possible when people stand up and demand it. And as the young man looked to the future, he felt a sense of hope, not just for himself, but for the world he was helping to create. Months had passed since the incident at the hotel, and the young man's life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. What had started as a humiliating experience had transformed into a powerful movement, one that resonated far beyond the walls of that luxurious hotel. He had become a symbol of resilience and hope, a voice for those who had been silenced by prejudice and discrimination. The hotel, too, had undergone a transformation. Under pressure from the public and guided by the young man and his mother, it had implemented sweeping changes to its policies and practices. Staff members underwent rigorous anti-bias training, and a new diversity and inclusion committee was established to ensure accountability. The hotel's corporate office issued a formal apology, not just to the young man but to all those who had ever been made to feel unwelcome. The manager, once arrogant and unyielding, had also begun to change. After his suspension, he had taken a hard look at himself and the biases he had carried for so long. He attended workshops and counseling sessions, determined to unlearn the prejudices that had shaped his actions. It wasn't easy, old habits die hard, but he was committed to becoming a better person. One day, the young man received a letter from the manager. It was handwritten, the words carefully chosen and filled with remorse. "I don't expect you to forgive me," the letter read. "What I did was wrong, and there's no excuse for it. But I want you to know that I'm trying to change. I'm learning, and I'm committed to doing better. Thank you for opening my eyes to the harm I caused, not just to you but to so many others. I hope one day I can make amends." The young man read the letter several times, his emotions swirling. He had every right to be angry, to hold on to the pain of that day. But as he thought about it, he realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing what had happened, it was about freeing himself from the weight of bitterness. He decided to meet with the manager, not to reconcile but to find closure. They met at a small cafe, the atmosphere tense but civil. The manager looked different, humbled, quieter, his earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet sincerity. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," the manager said, his voice trembling slightly. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I wanted to say this in person. I'm sorry. Truly sorry." The young man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I appreciate that," he said. "But this isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly because of who they are. If you're really sorry, then prove it. Be better. Do better." The manager nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I will," he said. "I promise." The meeting didn't magically erase what had happened, but it was a step forward, a small but significant moment of healing. The young man left the cafe feeling lighter, as if a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted. As the months turned into a year, the young man continued his advocacy work, traveling across the country to speak at schools, conferences, and community events. His story inspired countless people, and he became a beacon of hope for those who had faced similar struggles. His mother, ever his biggest supporter, watched with pride as he grew into his role as a leader and advocate. "You've turned something painful into something powerful," she told him one evening as they sat together, reflecting on everything that had happened. "That's what true strength looks like." The young man smiled, his heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You taught me to stand up for myself and for others. You showed me that change is possible, even when it feels impossible." The hotel, too, had become a model for change in the hospitality industry. It partnered with local organizations to promote diversity and inclusion, and its staff became known for their warmth and professionalism. The young man and his mother were invited to visit the hotel, not as guests but as partners in progress. As they walked through the lobby, the young man felt a sense of pride. The place that had once made him feel small and unwelcome was now a symbol of hope and transformation. The story of the young man and the hotel manager became a lesson in accountability, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. It reminded people that change begins with a single step, and that even in the face of injustice, there is always hope. As the young man looked to the future, he knew that the fight for equality was far from over. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. Together, with his mother, his community, and countless others who believed in a better world, he was ready to keep moving forward. And so, the story ended not with a conclusion, but with a beginning, a reminder that every ending is just the start of something new.